So this video talks about the network. So on your Synology NAS, whether that be a smaller desktop NAS or a longer NAS that would be used in a rack, for example, there of course are network points. Some NASs will have more than others. Some may have one, some may have two, some may have four, some may have more. And especially with the rack-based NASs, you can actually add additional cards to get additional network connectivity. So it really depends on how you're configuring your NAS, what areas here will be relevant for you. Now, generally, of course, your NAS is something that's pretty important. You have all your information on there. You know, if you're working in a business, you've probably got production data that cannot be lost, right? So it's important information. So it's always good to set up your NAS with some form of redundancy, right? So for example, if I just had one network point running into the back of a Synology NAS, and then for whatever reason that cable had an issue, or the port on the Synology NAS had an issue, or the port on the switch where it's plugged into, like the network switch where it's plugged into, has an issue, or the switch itself goes down, or something like that happens, then you potentially lose access to the data on your Synology NAS. So it's always good practice to have more than one network cable and configuration set up on your NAS, so that if one cable, the NAS itself, or the switch has a problem on that port or whatever, or the power or something, then it fails over to the other one. So it's always good to set it up in pairs or more than that. Obviously, the more ports you've got, the better. Now, of course, that also becomes very, very true if you're going to be setting up your NAS to be able to share, be shared, for example, on a iSCSI network, on an NFS network, something like that. Then you want to make sure that there's different sorts of data traffic to your management traffic. So that's something else that we can look at in more advanced features on a Synology NAS. But if we are right here, so we're logged into our DSM, of course, which is our software that is used to manage your entire Synology NAS. We can go into the control panel section, and you've got some access to some configuration information in here. All right, you've got Quick Connect under connectivity, you've got Quick Connect, you've got external access, you've got network, you've got DHCP server, you've got security. Now, what we're going to focus on in this video specifically is the network. So let's go ahead and click on that. And in here, you'll see a few things. Firstly, you'll see that the server name. So this is the name of my Synology NAS. My name is Aguero Synology. All right. The default gateway is 172.16.1.1. Of course, this is in my lab environment. And then some information here around IP version 6. If I want to set up IPv6 as a default gateway information, of course, by default, we're using IP version 4. And then there's an area here to actually set up some proxy information if you want to take advantage of the proxy. Now you can go into here and actually adjust the server name. All right, so once you've done the initial configuration of your Synology NAS, you've already entered in this information, you've already entered in the gateway, you can now go back into here and change it. All right, so under default gateway, if I click on edit, I can actually go and actually change this if I need to, up or down. You see that in my case, I've got LAN 1 and LAN 2. We'll touch this in a little bit once we go into this next tab over here. But what I've actually got on my Synology NAS here for this demo is there are 2 points on the back of this Synology NAS, and both points have got a network cable running into them, and they're running into 2 different switches. Okay, that's just the way that I've set it up. All right. So that is that. So now let's move into your network interface right here. You see that there I've got a number of different connections. So I've got LAN 1 and LAN 2. If you've got more than one network point, physical Ethernet, RJ45 network point on the back of your Synology NAS, then you'll have more than one listed. All right, in my case, I've got more than one. I've got LAN 1 and I've got LAN 2, and they are both connected, which means they're both running with a cable into a switch. I can click on this little drop down to see a little bit more information about this. You'll see that use DHCP for the first one is set to no because I've chosen to set a static IP address on this one physical point. That's the IP address, and that's some further information on IP version 6. The network status is that it's running at 100 megabits per second, full duplex, and the MTU is 1500. So what that means is that it's 100 megabits per second because on the switch, my switch is capable of running 1,000 megabits per second, which would be a gigabit network, of course, right? So if you've got a faster network, then that could be running at 10 gigabits per second. Or if you've got a slower, at 100 megabits per second, all right? LAN 2 is using DHCP. Of course, DHCP, which we'll cover in another video, is a DHCP server of some sort, is allocating IP addresses out to the network. The first one, LAN 1, is a static, so I've set a static IP. That's the IP that I want it to be. The second one, I've left it open. I've left that second point to go and explore my network and find something like a DHCP server, and the DHCP server has allocated 185 as its IP address. All right, so that's LAN 1 and LAN 2. I can select LAN 1, click on Edit right in here, and I've got access to go and change some information. And of course, while you were configuring your Synology NAS, you could go in and actually set this during that initial config stage, but now you can go back into here and change things. So here it is, here's my static IP, here is the gateway that we've assigned, and here is the DNS. Now the DNS, of course, 8.8.8.8 is a Google DNS, and that's the one that I've chosen to use right there. Now you'll see that it says use manual configuration. If I want to set it up the same way that LAN 2 is set up, then I can do DHCP, and that's the first option, and I can apply, and that will then remove that static IP, go out to the network and look for a dynamic IP address from a DHCP server. I can also set as a default gateway, I can change my MTU value, and I can also enable a VLAN if I so choose to. We're not going to be covering much of that in this training course, but just be aware that you can actually go and configure some additional settings in there if you want to have different sorts of performance from an MTU perspective. If you're having connection problems, if you are part of a virtual LAN or a VLAN, you can actually set that up all in there and actually allocate an ID, a VLAN ID, to your Synology NAS. IP version 6, if you want to use IP version 6, you can go and do that as well. By default, it's set to auto. So it's just on by default. You can actually set it to be off. If you don't even want it to be available in IP version 6, you can set it to off. In most cases, most people won't be using IP version 6. So I would say generally a good practice would be just to turn it off, because if it's not needed, why let the NAS go out and search for things on IP version 6? If it's not needed, just turn it off and you'll be okay. All right. And that is that. So I can say apply, okay. And that's all good. So that's LAN 1, and of course LAN 2, if you looked at those settings, you'll see that it's set to DHCP as the top option over there. All right. So that's the basics right there. You've got other things such as PPPoE, essentially PPP over Ethernet, and then IP version 6 tunneling. We're not going to cover those. So we're just assuming that you're just going to be connecting two cables over LAN 1, LAN 2, LAN 3, LAN 4, however many you may have. Okay. Now, the other thing is you can do right in here is you can do service order. So, for example, which is your primary point, right? So if you've got more than two, one needs to be primary, one is your secondary. All right, so I could say LAN 1 by default is my primary, or I can adjust it so now that LAN 2 becomes my primary point. All right, so you can set one of those two up. I like to have my LAN 1 as my primary, so I'll leave that. It's my service. Open vSwitch settings. So enable Open vSwitch. So this is vSwitch if you require to run Virtual Machine Manager. Now, there is a future video which we are going to be showing you how to use Virtual Machine Manager and actually get a VM running on your Synology NAS. So that's the point of that. If that is not turned on, it'll turn on when you are configuring this Virtual Machine Manager in a future video. All right. Now, what you can also do is if you click on this little Create button up here, there's a couple things. Create Bond, Create VPN Profile. Now, VPN Profile lets you go and actually set up a VPN connection for that. We're not going to cover that in this particular video, but one thing that you will look at is very quickly is Create Bond. So what this means is how do you want to configure these 2 points? So I've got 2 points, you may have more. This is only really relevant if you have 2 or more points, otherwise there's no point in it. But essentially link aggregation mode. So to enable link aggregation for network fault tolerance or load balancing, please select one of the following modes. So what this means is you can set up some stuff on the Synology NAS side of things. You can also set some stuff up on the switch side of things. So some switches are more smart than others and have this technology in here called dynamic link aggregation. So for example, some Cisco switches will let you plug in a device into that or 2 network points into that and take advantage of better load balancing. You can take advantage of faster speeds, fault tolerance, things like that from a switch level. Here we can actually set things up like that on the actual NAS level as well. So you can change between each of these 2, right? You can also set an active backup mode, provides fault tolerance only. So we're going to leave it as the top one. So essentially does not require any specific network switch support and is also able to connect 2 different switches. So that's the default. But if you have a switch and you want to configure it properly from a switch level and have the switch control some of that, then that's why you select this second option over here, okay? But that's really for something more advanced. If you want to learn more about networking terminologies and how the switching and routing and everything, all that works on there, that's what that is for. And that's also true from a static route perspective. If you want to understand what static routing is, that's a different course. You're going to have to understand a little bit more about network terminologies and what a static route actually means. Traffic control, you can actually set what sort of traffic you want to control, right? So you can actually guarantee certain bandwidth to go up and down depending on what sort of traffic it is. So for example, maybe some video files are going to be able to go through quicker because they're more important, or some, video footage or audio or things like that. You can actually control that from in there. We're not going to go into too much detail on there. Then finally is some DSM settings. So by default, to access your Synology NAS is going to be connecting over HTTP or HTTPS, which of course is the secured version of HTTP, over these two ports. So you've got the ability right there to change those two ports. There's a whole bunch of other settings in here if you do want to go and customize them. But for most people, you probably just want to leave all of this standard. Be aware that it's here. You can import things such as certificates and other things to sort of make your Synology login a bit more secure. So just be aware that this is here. It's an option for you if you do want to go and customize and change further things. So that's a bit of a high level overview around the network on your Synology NAS.